The winter of 1983 wrapped Wetzel County, West Virginia, in a bitter chill. Snow drifted silently across the empty stretch of Route 250, where only the occasional car broke the silence. On the morning of February 13, 1983, two elderly residents drove cautiously along the icy road. Through the frost-blurred windshield, they noticed something lying in the snow near the shoulder. At first, it seemed like a mannequin, discarded, lifeless, strangely out of place in the bleak white landscape. But as they pulled over and stepped out into the biting cold, the horrifying truth became clear. What they saw was not plastic. It was flesh. There, half covered in snow, lay the naked body of a woman with striking auburn hair. Her skin had already begun to pale against the frozen ground, but investigators would later determine she had not been there long. Her body was too exposed, too untouched by the snowfall that surrounded her. The victim, estimated between 35 and 45 years old, was unlike the stereotypical image of a transient or runaway that small-town residents might have expected. She appeared well-groomed, her legs and underarms freshly shaven. This detail suggested she had not been living rough, but instead had been cared for, or had cared for herself, only shortly before her death. Whoever left her there had chosen the location carefully, isolated enough to go unnoticed, yet close enough to the road to discard her quickly and vanish into the mist. Near the body, investigators found tire tracks and footprints, evidence that she had been transported from elsewhere. Police determined she had been dead for approximately 2 days. The scene was both chilling and calculated, suggesting the work of someone experienced, someone who knew how to dispose of a body without being seen. At that moment, detectives treated it as a single homicide. Yet this discovery would become the opening chapter of a much darker story. This woman was not the first to die at the hands of her killer. She was simply the first to be recognized as part of a terrifying pattern that would haunt the highways of the American South for years. Her identity remained a mystery. No missing person reports matched her description. She was buried as a Jane Doe, her name erased, her story untold. And while investigators worked quietly to find answers, the roads of West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and beyond would soon reveal that this was not an isolated murder. It was the beginning of one of America's most chilling true crime sagas, the Redhead Murders. This first discovery set the tone for the nightmare to follow. A woman with reddish hair, strangled and abandoned, left not in the chaos of a city, but on the quiet margins of a rural highway. She was not just a victim, she was a signal. A warning that a predator was moving silently across state lines, using America's interstate system as his hunting ground. And tragically, she would not be the last. By the fall of 1984, America's southern highways were carrying more than commuters and travelers. They had become silent corridors of death. On September 16, 1984, a body surfaced in West Memphis, Arkansas, along the edge of Interstate 40. She wore nothing but a sweater. Her reddish hair clung to her lifeless face. She would later be identified as 28-year-old Lisa Nichols, a woman estranged from her family in West Virginia. Estranged or not, she was someone's daughter, someone's sister. Now, she was just another victim discarded along the roadside. Lisa's death echoed the mysterious killing in West Virginia the year before, but investigators had not yet drawn a solid link. They were still treating these murders as isolated crimes. That illusion would shatter on New Year's Day, 1985. In the quiet, cold mountains of Tennessee, near Jellicoe along Interstate 75, another body was discovered. She had been bound, strangled, and thrown carelessly down a steep embankment. This young woman's reddish curls framed a face that would never see justice in her lifetime. Even more tragic, she was pregnant, 10 to 12 weeks along. For decades, she was known only as Campbell County Jane Doe. She had no voice, no name, no one to claim her. Investigators estimated her age between 17 and 25, a young woman robbed not only of her future, but of her unborn child's as well. 3 states, 3 women, 3 bodies left along major interstates, 1 strangled in West Virginia, 1 abandoned in Arkansas, 1 bound and discarded in Tennessee. All had reddish hair. All had been stripped of clothing and dignity. A chilling pattern was beginning to emerge, but law enforcement did not yet recognize the true scope of what they were facing. The killer, or killers, were not choosing random victims. They were hunting. They were stalking highways like predators, scanning for the vulnerable. Hitchhikers, young women estranged from their families, those living transient lives with no one to immediately notice their disappearance. To the public, these victims were whispers, quickly buried in small-town headlines and forgotten by most. But to investigators in the know, unease was growing. How many more women would turn up along the interstates? How many nameless graves would fill before authorities realized a serial killer was using America's highways as his dumping ground? This was more than coincidence. This was ritual. The killer's pattern was deliberate, and his message was cruel. These women were disposable. The tragedy of Chapter 2 is not just in the murders themselves, but in what they symbolized. At the dawn of 1985, rural America was waking up to a horrifying reality. The interstate system, built to connect the country, was being weaponized by a predator. What should have been a lifeline of travel and opportunity had become a predator's killing field. And yet, the story was only beginning. April 1, 1985. The rolling hills of Knox County, Kentucky woke to a discovery so macabre that it would scar the community for decades. Alongside Route 25, an abandoned white refrigerator sat half buried in weeds and brush, a discarded appliance that blended into the rural roadside landscape. At first glance, it was nothing unusual, just another piece of roadside trash. But inside that refrigerator lay a nightmare. When officers pried open the door, they were greeted by the sight of a woman's nude body curled unnaturally inside. The only clothing she wore were 2 pairs of socks, and around her neck hung 2 distinct pendants, small tokens hinting at the life she once lived. The most chilling detail, however, was on the refrigerator itself. On the front door, a bold decal read Superwoman. The cruel irony struck investigators immediately. Whoever stuffed her inside had mocked her final moments, trapping her in a space designed for preservation, but instead using it as a coffin. The woman had reddish hair, aligning her with the mysterious victims already surfacing across the South. Cause of death: suffocation. For years, she would be known only as Knox County Jane Doe. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small town of Gray, Kentucky. Nearly 500 locals attended her funeral, an event so unusual it was televised by regional stations. Strangers mourned her as if she were family, because in truth, no one knew her name. She was buried without an identity, another Jane Doe among the growing trail of bodies linked to the same chilling pattern. Just 2 weeks later, the horror spread again. On April 14, 1985, in Greene County, Tennessee, another young woman's body was found. She had light brown hair with subtle reddish highlights. This victim, estimated to be between 14 and 20 years old, was brutally killed by blunt force trauma and possibly stabbed. Like one of the earlier victims, she was also pregnant, 6 to 8 weeks along. The killer was escalating, becoming bolder, more brutal, and perhaps more desperate. By this point, it was undeniable. Someone was prowling the highways of America's South with a methodical pattern. The victims were almost always young women with reddish hair, many with transient lifestyles that left them vulnerable. They were stripped, strangled, suffocated, or beaten, and then abandoned in places where they might not be discovered for days. Refrigerators, embankments, wooded stretches of interstate, all chosen as cruel resting places for women the killer considered disposable. For investigators, the case was growing colder by the day despite the rising number of victims. Each new discovery added to the body count but not to the answers. Were these murders the work of one man? Or had multiple predators discovered how easily women could vanish along America's sprawling highway system? The Knox County refrigerator victim became one of the most infamous symbols of the case. A young woman erased, her final resting place turned into a grotesque message. She was Superwoman only in death, a Jane Doe silenced but unforgettable. The highways had claimed another soul, and the shadow of the Redhead Murders was spreading. By 1985, investigators across the South were finally forced to confront a chilling reality. These were not isolated killings. There was a predator, methodical, mobile, and merciless, using America's interstate system as his personal hunting ground. The details were disturbingly consistent. Victims were almost always young women with reddish hair. They were found nude or partially clothed, their lives ended by strangulation, suffocation, or brutal assault. Their bodies were abandoned in wooded ditches, under bridges, or even inside discarded appliances. And nearly every one of them was discovered just off a major highway. The profile that began to emerge was both terrifying and precise. The killer had to be someone who traveled constantly, who knew the backroads, rest stops, and hidden pull-offs along the interstates that crisscross Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi, and West Virginia. That pointed investigators toward a single possibility: a long-haul truck driver. Truckers lived their lives on the highway. They knew where law enforcement presence was light, where to stop without raising suspicion, and where to leave a body so it might go unnoticed for days. They also had easy access to potential victims: hitchhikers, sex workers, runaways, women society often overlooked, making them tragically easy targets. The theory gained frightening credibility in 1985, when a truck driver named Jerry Leon Johns was arrested in Tennessee. Johns had picked up a woman with red hair, attempted to strangle her with fabric torn from her own t-shirt, and then dumped her, bound and gagged, under a highway overpass. Against all odds, she survived. Her name was Linda Shank, and her testimony painted a picture almost identical to the fates of the Redhead victims. The parallels were undeniable. Johns was a trucker. He targeted a red-haired woman. He strangled her, left her near an interstate, and assumed she would never be found alive. It was a near-perfect match. Yet, at the time, investigators could not definitively link him to the string of murders. He was convicted of kidnapping Linda, but suspicion of his role in the wider killings faded as the years passed. Meanwhile, the murders didn't stop. Bodies continued to surface along interstates, each case more gruesome than the last. The killer, or killers, seemed to understand how law enforcement worked in the 1980s. With victims scattered across multiple states, investigations became fragmented. Each jurisdiction had its own files, its own priorities, and without modern databases or DNA testing, it was almost impossible to connect the dots in real time. For the victims' families, this meant years of torment. Some never even knew their loved ones had been found. Most recently, in 2023, investigators identified another victim, 23-year-old Michelle Levon Inman of Nashville, Tennessee. For years, she was buried under the name Cheatham County Jane Doe. At last, her family learned the truth. Each identification was more than a forensic victory. It was a resurrection of identity. These women were no longer just case numbers or forgotten corpses. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. They had names. They had stories. And they deserved justice. Still, questions remained. While one suspect, trucker Jerry Leon Johns, was eventually tied to at least one murder through DNA, not every victim could be connected to him. Were they all killed by the same man, or had multiple predators taken advantage of America's highways? For the first time in decades, the nameless had a voice. Their families could finally mourn with answers. Yet the full truth of the Redhead murders was still just out of reach. Lurking somewhere on the endless highways where their lives had been stolen. For years, the Redhead murders hovered on the edge of obscurity, remembered only by grieving families and a handful of relentless detectives. But in an unexpected twist, the path toward resolution came not from a police task force, but from a group of high school students. In 2018, sociology teacher Alexis Marshall of Elizabethton, Tennessee, gave her forensic science class a challenge: study the cold case of the Redhead murders and see what they could uncover. These teenagers approached the case with fresh eyes, poring through news clippings, forensic details, and autopsy records. What they produced was astonishing: a detailed profile of the killer that mirrored law enforcement's long-held suspicions. Their research suggested the murderer was most likely a long-haul truck driver who targeted vulnerable women with reddish hair, disposing of their bodies along interstates where he could quickly disappear. The students' work reignited national interest. Their findings were presented to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and suddenly, a case that had gone cold for over 30 years was back in the headlines. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and investigators began revisiting the files. And soon after, science delivered the evidence that investigators had always lacked. In 2019, DNA technology linked one victim, Tina Marie McKenna Farmer, directly to Jerry Leon Johns, the truck driver who had tried to kill Linda Shank in 1985. Johns had died in prison in 2015, but his DNA lived on in police databases. At last, there was undeniable proof that at least one of the Redhead murders had been his work. But the discovery raised an even darker question. Was Johns responsible for all of the killings, or were other predators roaming the same highways at the same time? The FBI believes it is possible that more than one serial killer exploited America's interstate system in the 1980s. With so many victims spread across multiple states, the Redhead murders may represent a web of violence committed by more than one man. For the families, the revelations brought bittersweet closure. They finally had names for their daughters, sisters, and mothers. They had answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. Yet the complete truth remains frustratingly out of reach. Some victims are still unidentified. some murders remain unproven, and the possibility of additional victims has never been ruled out. Today, the Redhead murders are remembered as a grim symbol of how vulnerable women fell through the cracks of society in the 1980s. Many were runaways, sex workers, or struggling with addiction. People society too often ignored. Their killer, or killers, counted on that neglect. But through persistence, forensic science, and even the determination of high school students, their voices have begun to rise again. The highways where they were silenced still stretch across the South, endless and unforgiving. Yet their names, their stories, and their memory now travel those same roads, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. The Redhead murders remain one of America's most haunting mysteries, but the victims are victims no more. They are remembered. They are seen. And their truth still echoes through the asphalt corridors where a predator once hunted in the shadows.